I'm not all that happy with the notions of Protestants in the Irish language or Catholics in the Irish language. It's a bit of a them and us kind of thing. But I suppose the title, I probably gave it myself without thinking very much about it. Protestants in the Irish language, Catholics in the Irish language. It's really brings us back to the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Now, the important things that came out of the Reformation, leaving aside religion, the important thing that came out was, first of all, the printing of simple books in the ordinary language of the people. So the simplification of the language and the publication of books. Now you had a great rush. Queen Elizabeth sent over a printing press to print a catechism, Queen Elizabeth I. The response to that on the Catholic side is the Louvain School, who bought their own printing, this was the Franciscan College there, bought their own printing press and began to send Irish books, printed in Irish, Catholic books, back to Ireland. And we have records, plenty of records, in the local newspapers of the time, of ships being intercepted at the quays in Dublin, full of books written by the Louvain Franciscan fathers. So, I mean, even that Acrimonious, they're on the side of the Counter-Reformation, so it's Reformation versus Counter-Reformation. And I like to leave that all behind me. If you come into the 18th century in Ireland, the great philosophical ideas there is the notion of Romanticism, which is still everywhere in this country. That looking back to the past, that trying to recreate country values, the values of country people. And that led in many ways to the founding of the Gaelic League, to the work that people like Hyde did, and Hyde is a most central character because Hyde's a propagandist, and he's excellent. And I've read papers from the McNaughtons, from the big unionist families here in the north, who went to hear Hyde in St. Mary's Hall and came out saying, this man is marvellous and he has the most wonderful ideas. And remember that the early Gaelic League, as a society, brought all kinds of people together. Protestants, Catholics, Jews and people who had no religion. And that was largely due to Hyde, because Hyde had this tremendous gift for selling his subject matter to all kinds of people. Now, I want to concentrate today on women from North Antrim, who became involved in the Irish language movement. Ireland is a closed book to those who do not know her language. No one can really know Ireland until he knows the language. Her treasures are as hidden as a book unopened. Open the book and learn to love your language. Now you might think that came from an extreme Gaelic leaguer. It came from a woman called Margaret Dobbs, who died in 1962. And it was in 1945 she said it, when she was presented with a special presentation by Fashioning Land in North Antrim. The Feis had, and indeed still has and still survives to this day, a wide range of cultural activities under its banner and to its credit. And here was Miss Dobbs of solid unionist stock, putting her finger on the great passion of her own life. Margaret Emmeline Dobbs was born in Dublin but spent most of her long and extraordinary life in the Glens of Antrim. What is perhaps even more remarkable is that she was only one of a group of women from the Protestant and Unionist tradition at the time in the Glens of Antrim, who devoted their energies and considerable talents to the language and cultural values of the ordinary people of Ireland. In a certain sense, they gathered around Miss Dobbs, and her home in Portnagal and Cushendall became for them a focal point where they came frequently to renew their energies and their close friendships. There was Rose Maud Young, died in 1947, of the Youngs of Galgoram House in Ballymena. There was Margaret Hutton from Malone Road here in Belfast. There was Ada McNeil of the McNeils of Glendon, whose Cúna Glass, published in 1914, contained the first literary effort of Seamus Green, the well-known Irish writer. It was, as I've said, Margaret Hutton, translator of the time, and a close friend and supporter of Patrick Pearse in his efforts to establish the Irish language school in Dublin. And there was Gertrude Parry and her sisters Una and Eilish MacDonald of Glenariff, whose ancestor, Dr. Seamus MacDonald, had done so much in the late 18th century and early 19th century in Belfast to promote the Irish language and foster the welfare of the poor in that city. Indeed, in many ways, it's with Dr. James MacDonald, or Dr. Seamus MacDonald as he was known to the Irish of Glenariff, that we should begin our story. The Irish revival of 1893, the founding of the Gaelic League, had been preceded by almost a century by a very similar revival in 18th century Belfast, and most significantly in the heart of Presbyterian Belfast. In 1795, Patrick Lynch of Lough Island, County Down, a member of the Lynch family, ran a classical school in County Down, down to Patrick, where Presbyterians and Catholics were educated together, and he published Bolligan Tuller, a literary magazine, the first of its kind to be devoted to the Irish language. It contained poems and stories and translations by Charlotte Brooke, who had died a few years earlier. Lynch was a scribe and a poor scholar in the traditional Irish mode. The Northern Star newspaper, which carried an announcement about the publication, has this to say: an attempt to revive the grammatical and critical knowledge of the Irish language in this town, Belfast, is generously made by Mr. Lynch. He teaches publicly in the academy and privately in several families. Mr. Lynch is in the language he says is particularly interesting to all those who wish for the improvement and union of this neglected and divided kingdom. By our understanding and speaking the language, we could more easily and effectively communicate our sentiments and instructions to all our countrymen, and thus mutually improve and conciliate each other's affections. Dr. Seamus MacDonald from the Glens was at the very heart of this revival. He was to a large extent the organising force behind the Harp Festival of 1793. The whole Romantic movement of the 19th century placed a great deal of emphasis on music. And this really was what lay behind the Harp Festival in Belfast, which sent Bunting out through the country collecting traditional Irish airs, on which Bunting's reputation lasted. It inspired Bunting, and Bunting, with the prompting of Dr. MacDonald and others, began the scientific collection of traditional airs. It was, after all, in the heart of rationalist Presbyterian Belfast, as Moira McNeill has written, that the renaissance of Irish music took place. Bunting went out and collected the tunes, Lynch went and collected the words of the songs, and those manuscripts are held here in Queen's University Library here in Belfast. The 1798 Rising drastically undermined the effectiveness of Lynch and MacDonald, but MacDonald was back in 1833 and elected chairperson of Cohesion Gaelic Ulla, with the young Robert McAdam as secretary. Cohesion Gaelic Ulla, or the Ulster Gaelic Society, was in many ways a unique society in 19th century Ireland. There was a plethora of societies: the Hibernian Catholic Society, founded in 18, the Irish Archaeological Society, founded in 1840, the Celtic Society, founded in 1845, to mention only a few in 18th century Ireland. These societies and organisations placed their emphasis and interest almost exclusively on the past, and were greatly influenced by European Romanticism. They concentrated to a large extent on antiquarianism and quietly ignored the living language of the great numbers of the poor Irish who were everywhere around them throughout the Irish countryside. McAdam and MacDonald and the members of the Ulster Gaelic Society, on the other hand, placed their emphasis on the Irish of the poor and marginalised the living language, and which carried their intellectual and emotional life of the ordinary Irish. Thus McAdam was up on the glens, sitting with the old speakers, recording their stories and songs, and speaking their language. The Monast of Enoch had been sent up to Ballinascreen to set up a school there for the native Irish. The point of the school was that they would learn how to write their language. The 100 who were native speakers, they were all native speakers of Irish, or most of them were, but they never had any training in the Irish. This then is the crucial difference, and it's an idea which the Gaelic League borrowed so effectively at the turn of the last century, and sent Pearse and O'Grownie and MacNeill to Inishmaan and to the west coast of Ireland to get a grasp of the living language where it was strongest. It is perhaps the single most credential idea which the League had, and because it helped to break down the barriers between people and between classes, it brought the educated middle classes from the towns into contact with the ordinary Irish of the countryside and gave the country its and give the countryman the bearer of the tradition, which Sir McLean used to talk about, the people who carried the traditions with them. The bearer of the tradition, give him a status and a place in a society which he or she had not possessed in over 3 centuries. Robert Shipboy McAdam was a prosperous businessman. He had, with his brother James, inherited the family business, the Soho Foundry, and was all his life essentially engaged in the affairs of the family business. But the consuming passion of his life was the Irish language and the preservation and promotion of the culture enshrined in that language. He was a Presbyterian, yet he sat in the cabin of the poor Irish Catholics, noting down what they had to say, preserving the traditions that they had received orally and which they were only too willing to transmit. Gaelic Manuscript 31, the Belfast Public Library, contains some examples of the recordings McAdam made in the Glens of Antrim. Jesahar and Mullian, Eririd and Yilian, on the landing of the French, taken down from Lane when he was blind drunk. Is there Imagine in ye a whole and scale, Cohesion dialect, Jamie Cambridge. We edited Oscar and Aga one, a description of a giantess from John McNeill of the Lens. Curramavanach the non Theata Mechanagran, and Reinandon from Cohesion P.H. Garrett, Garshul. In other words, it was the kind of thing that you wouldn't say put on the radio or in the presence of children. In 1833, 3 years after the founding of the Ulster Gaelic Society, there was founded here in Belfast a Ladies' Gaelic Society, with aims similar to the aims of the Ulster Gaelic Society. And it is there, I believe, that the origin, the antecedents of these Protestant women of the Glens I'm talking about lies. There's just one other point which I think must be made about the Ulster Gaelic Ladies' Gaelic Society, which is appropriate here. In 1841 they published a little book called An Irish Primer, compiled and published under the patronage of the Ladies' Gaelic Society. They added to that publication a short catechism, 19th century Ireland, 19th century Europe, and 19th century England. Religion is a big matter. I know that has all changed but in the 19th century it was a huge business. They added to that publication a short catechism and some religious materials, and they speak in that section of the importance in the work for the language of avoiding anything and everything which might lead to miscish, agus ruin, which might lead to malice and ill will. They say keep that all away from it. One could spend a lot of time, and I hope some of our students around Belfast here takes up this Ladies Gaelic Society and pursues them. They're largely the wives of the men that are involved in the language movement in the Ulster Gaelic Society. Could digress for a centre from my dad. In the 1840s, the Irish language world in Ulster here was riven by a most unseemly and bitter row between Presbyterians and Catholics over the teaching of the Bible through the medium of the Irish language. The row is well documented as it was fought out in the leading papers of the day. The Vindicator on the Catholic side, the Banner of Ulster on the Protestant side. It was a bitter, acrimonious battle, and in many ways meaningless to us today. And distinguished clerics from the Presbyterian and Catholic side launched into each other without restraint and with language which at times knew little bounds. They ended up, indeed as they had begun, by calling each other liars and brigands and fools and rogues. It did irreparable damage to the language cause here in the north. And it's no harm here again today, over 150 years later, to ask forgiveness for all the harsh things that were said, for all the cruel innuendo, and to assert again that the Gaelic, Ulster Ladies Gaelic Society had done with great wisdom when they published their little grammar, that malice or ill feeling or hatred have no place whatever in work for the language. That's the middle of the 19th, just before the famine. Irish, to a great extent, had been on the run in the 19th century. The decline of the language had been underway since the collapse of the Gaelic system in the 17th century. The Irish language and the cultural tradition and the language carried had few protectors and few promoters in the new dispensation of the 17th century. Throughout the 18th century, in spite of penal laws, in spite of constant process of marginalisation inflicted on the native Catholic Irish, and it should be said to a great extent also in the Presbyterian community here in Ulster, the language still retained a vigour, and the culture and literary tradition was still vibrant. Evelyn Doibhlin in McAdam lamented her husband Art O'Leary. O'Leary had been murdered treacherously near Carriganim in West Cork in May 1773. The lament is the most original and unique piece of literature. She recalls her days as Dumson Naravira Harish Parlus Segaladum Rumanam Rakahum Bakus Segargahum Briki Arvarahum, and so on. It's a beautiful, powerful lament for her husband. It shows you the vitality that is still in the language, even though it has been greatly marginalised. It's not in the papers, it's not in the media, it's not in the television, it's not anywhere there. And it's a great, it nevertheless is still alive well. Owen O'Neill of Banvale in County Down was drowned in the River Bann in September 1747. He was a distinguished member of an old Irish family, the O'Neills of Clandeboy, with roots stretching back to Tullachog and Tiroin and further back to Ailech and Donegal, and the beginnings of recorded history in Ireland. His untimely death was a tragedy for the family and the entire local community. Seamus McPaulding, Vicar General of the Diocese of Dromore, preached the funeral sermon over Owen O'Neill, and Patrick Lynch, who I mentioned earlier, made a copy in a manuscript and recorded it for posterity. The sermon is a plea for mercy from the soul of Owen O'Neill. The preacher praises the generosity and good character of Owen O'Neill and carefully and accurately traces his genealogical line back through the O'Neills of Clonlaboy and Tullyhog. The sermon and the lament both show that, as far as the emotional life goes, Irish was still the language of the heart, even among the aristocracy, or what was left of the Gaelic aristocracy. Nevertheless, the language had been caused adrift. The most graphic description of the state to which the language has been reduced is to be found in Andreas Ó Doibhlin's Catechism of the Irish Language, which was published in Paris in 1742. Doibhlin was prefect of studies at the college. In his catechism, he put his fingers on the weakness of the position of the Irish language within Irish society. It is no wonder then, he says, that a language of neither court, nor city, nor bar, nor business, ever since the beginning of King James I's reign, should have suffered vast alterations and corruptions, and is now on the brink of utter decay, as it really is, to the great dishonour and shame of the natives. Irish throughout the 18th century was cut off from all those major areas of life and experience. It wasn't in the universities, and it wasn't in the schools. It wasn't in the scores. It was scarcely in the churches, and throughout the 19th century the Catholic Church ran away from the language, abandoned the language. It was the property still of the poor masses and became identified with poverty and backwardness. Those who were seeking to get on in the world had to opt for the world of English. In 1950, Professor Brian O'Keefe published a paper on the state of the language throughout the 19th century and the early years of this century, and he has this to say: a century ago we would have found Irish in every county in Ireland, and Gaeltachtaí either fear or brat in 22 or 23 counties. And that was true in the north as well. The Irish died in South Derry about 1747, I think the last speaker said. There was a huge Gaeltacht in Tyrone, huge Gaeltacht, and it survived really until 1960. I remember my eldest son putting him in the car and bringing him up so that he would be able to say that he had spoken with the last native speaker of Tyrone Irish. And she was an old lady, Ellen Mary Biddy Devlin. She was a Devlin as well, of course, they're everywhere. And we had a long conversation. She knew Irish. I mean, people knew lines of songs and bits of prayers and things like that. But you could say Wakatu and she would say Hanik. No, she knew the language still. And her daughter in the house didn't understood what she was saying but couldn't converse with her. And that's how Irish was slowly and surely lost. I met her in video with an external examiner ahead of where we went down for I don't know what reason, took us to Omagh. Probably the drink was cheaper there. But I met her on the street and I greeted her in Irish and she spoke to me in Irish and we talked for a good while. She was over 90 when she died. And the external from England said to me, is there much Irish spoken here? Oh, I said about 40–50% still. So funny, I thought it was so funny, he was standing gaping at us, you know. But same in South Armagh, Irish survived in South Armagh until the 70s. Cardinal O'Fia used to say that he remembered two old women, Granny and her daughter, in the post office in Cullyhanna getting their pension through Irish. They were talking Irish to each other. And I know that the last speakers in Ballinascreen there were two old ladies, Murray, they were two sisters. And they were regarded as, you know, their heads had gone, they were talking this. They were still clinging to the tradition they had. They were still native speakers of Irish. And all that kind of thing, Irish were reduced greatly. The basic objective that the Gaelic League had was to halt the decline of Irish and to re-establish it in the towns and in the cities. But to a certain degree, almost certainly they failed in that. But like the Belfast revivalists, they placed their whole emphasis on the living language. And they gave back to the tradition bearers a prestige and an influence which they never had had before. The basic objectives of the League were culture. It was only later they became embroiled. That Miss Dobbs that I mentioned, she was a founder of Common to Man. But you've got to remember that Common to Man was, in the early years, it was a feminist movement. It wasn't a political, it was eventually, like most other things, taken over by the political guys. And so there's the middle classes in the towns, and the upper classes, Catholic, Protestant and the centre, came together in the early years of the century to learn and cultivate the language and cultural traditions of the ordinary people of Ireland. This was a crucial aspect of the League's success. So it was that Margaret Dobbs, Rose Maud Young, Ada McNeill, Margaret Hutton, Gertrude Parry all became involved in the effort to rescue the language. Their role is unique and I really believe particularly significant. Miss Dobbs, Miss Young, Ada McNeill and Margaret Hutton came from solid unionist backgrounds. They were relatively well off. Miss Dobbs could afford in the early years of this century to give £600 to the Casement Defence Fund. Remember, Casement was a near neighbour. And that's a considerable sum of money in those days. She had been born in Dublin and she first came in contact with Irish, Scottish Gaelic, we believe, through a servant who was employed in her home. There's a lot of mythology about Miss Dobbs up in Northampton and stories about her. Anecdotal stuff which I don't believe anymore. A lot of it you have to be very careful of. She was organist at Cushendall Church of Ireland Church. And as organist there, when the war was won in the 1940s, the priest or the minister turned around and said, we'll play the national anthem. We'll all stand for attention and play the anthem. And Miss Dobbs, of course, was the organist, and she struck up the soldier's song. But I mean, she fought with everyone. She tramped over everyone. She was a great lady. And didn't go down too well in Cushendall, I can assure you. She came in, she was taught Irish by the Gaelic League employed native speakers largely, wandering teachers who went from class to class on bicycles in the night time. And she was taught by one Hugh Flatley. Now Hugh Flatley came up from County Mayo, that was his employment. And he stayed with Miss Dobbs. He had a daughter who lived in Cushendall, whom I knew, she's dead. And he had a son who lived in Maharfelt, would you believe it, who was a pharmacist. They had no Irish at all, but he was a native speaker of Irish. And he taught Miss Dobbs Irish. It must have been a very difficult task teaching Miss Dobbs anything, because she was involved in the Irish College in Garda Hark, the College Ulla, and she taught there. And her brother James Dobbs was one of those Orange Men unionists who brought in the guns at Larne. So what kind of a household have you? You have Margaret who would go through you for a near cut, and you have James Dobbs who's bringing in the guns to the Ulster. It's very interesting. Margaret Hutton was the wife of a Belfast industrialist, a member of the Gaelic League and a scholar. Her home on the Malone Road was a centre of culture and artistic activity in Belfast. She was frequently up in the glens with Miss Dobbs. She was a close friend of Pearse and a benefactor of his on many occasions in the educational and cultural projects he had in hand. A letter from Pearse to her in 1910 runs, "Cara Gidl, 1,000 thanks for your generous promise of £50 towards the development of Scoiliana." This was the school that Pearse had founded in Dublin. Pearse writes the most beautiful, gentle letters. It's hard to see him as a revolutionary at all, like that. He writes the most beautiful letters to these people. He said, in a visit to Belfast, he had stayed with Margaret Hutton. "It is kind of you to offer me hospitality during my stay in Belfast. Misha Lamas Moore, the Chara Podri McPears." Now,
The other thing you've got to remember about Miss Hutton had translated the town into English. It's the one book that Pearse brought into the GPO with him. And the first shell that hit the roof of the GPO, the book was split asunder. So maybe something significant in that or not, I don't know, but I know that that's recorded in the 1960 writing. It was the one book that Pearse brought into the GPO with him. Remember, Pearse was a bookish man. There's one other letter. Mrs. Hutton was in touch with Pearse. She wanted to go to Rossmuck and she wished to stay at the Pearse cottage, which is still there. He wrote back to her giving her detailed directions of how she might reach Mam's Cross. And he says, I am writing to Brookley Park as Miss Young told me you would be there next week. The Miss Young referred to here is almost certainly Miss Rose Maud Young of Galgarm House, Ballymena, the 7th of 12 children born to John Young, Chief Sheriff and Deputy Lieutenant in Antrim, and Grace Charlotte Savage from County Down, one of the Savages from County Down. They were Church of Ireland. The Youngs were strictly Presbyterian. They had been prosperous merchants in Ballymena and acquired Galgarm with its 2,000 acres in 1850. Their uncle, a local doctor, had trained in Edinburgh, knew MacDonald, and had the same kind of reputation. Dr. Jim MacDonald had a marvellous reputation here in Belfast. He saw the poor for free. On the weekend that he died, they were cured outside in Donegal Place, they were cured outside his house because he didn't charge the poor anything. And this Dr. Young in Ballymena was the exact same kind of a man. So the Youngs became, of course, they lost a lot of their fortune in bad investments in South America. These Youngs were in good terms with the landed gentry in Antrim, and there was much toing and froing between Galgarm and the other country houses, especially among the young people for parties and outings. In addition, the diaries of Rose Young, Roishni Ogan as she called herself, which were kindly placed at my disposal by the late Rosemary Lady Brookborough, whose great aunt Rose Young was. It was a kind of saga trying to track this lady. I saw the name Neoga. Doing that affair get sat on my desk for years, and I saw the name Neoga, and I said, that's Tipperary. And I'm in with a certain man from the Glens of Antrim, who's dead now. And he said, do you know anything about Neoga? He says, who is Neoga? She says, sure, those books in Irish, 3 books in Irish. I thought for a while, and then I remembered the books. I said, she's not done nothing to it. He says, she's Young from Galgarm. She transited herself into Neoga. So then I went to find out the Youngs of Galgarm, and of course they're gone, and the Brookboroughs are there now. There's a magnificent golf course there, and if you play golf at the present time. So we went there and we tried, as you know, in South Derry, Jimmy Chichester Clark, former Prime Minister here in Northern Ireland. He's a Chichester, and the Chichesters are related to the Youngs, and I went to him and he said, no, he said, but I tried Lady Brookborough, she might know. So I rang Lady Brookborough and I said, do you know Rose Young? Have you ever heard of Rose Young? Of course I have, she said, she was my aunt. I said, have you any information on her, you know, anything? She said, I have her diaries, come down here and I'll give them to you. And that is followed by several visits to her. She gave me the diaries, she let me take them home. They're here now, I think, because I recommended to her very strongly that she put them somewhere where they would be safe. And she follows from her beginnings of her life, really. I believe these people were encouraged to write diaries to help with their English. And remember, these people had no formal education at all. The diaries are 2 solid notebooks, and they're in a very clear, neat hand. She rewrote them over the years. They're a chronicle of the family comings and goings and of her own activities. Volume 1 is entitled Rose Maud Young, extract from a series of old diaries. And these diaries are held by Lady Brooke, where they're now here at the Public Records Office in Belfast. Rose Young's great claim to fame was her splendid anthology of Irish verse, which was published in 3 volumes, Volume 1 in 1921, Volume 2 in 1924, and Volume 3 in 1930. So all the upheavals in Ireland did not deflect this girl at all. She was doing one thing. The dates are important, for they reveal that her interest in Irish survived the political upheavals of the last century. The 3 volumes reveal a sense of taste and fine literary judgment, as well as a competence to deal with solid academic matters in which she had little formal training. Miss Young was tutored privately at Glengarry. She left the schoolroom at Christmas 1884, then over 19. Well, these people were reared entirely differently from we Devlins at the Loop were reared. First of all, you didn't speak at the kitchen table until you were 18. You didn't get sitting at the kitchen table with your parents until you were 18. You didn't get speaking until you were 21. And there was a big house and there was 12 children. She was attached to them all, comes through in her diaries. She acted a while as governess in the school in Galgarm in her own house. And in 1892 she began reading for the Cambridge Higher Locals and sat the examination in Latin and French in the Drapers' Hall in London in 1893. In 1899 she entered Cambridge Training College, and having successfully completed the course became a private tutor for a spell in Scarborough. Branagh and Eora, who wrote the biography of these people, suggest that Rose Young got her interest in Irish from Bishop Reeves. And this may be, well, I believe that's where she got her interest in Irish. Bishop Reeves was curate in Ballymena for long years. And he was a frequent visitor to the young household. And he was a top-class scholar. I mean, Bishop Reeves' work survives to this day, probably one of the great. Did he know Irish? Some people say he did, others say he didn't. But he certainly knew the relevance of it and the importance of it. Miss Young had stayed with the bishop at Conway House here in Bendonmurray to see some manuscripts he had bought. Reeves went back to the sources. And if you read his book on Columba or his book Cotton's Visitation of the Diocese of Derry, you see the influence that the Latin language had on him. I suspect that she and other members of her family and families, even at this early stage, may have had some knowledge of spoken Irish. Reeves had been curate in Ballymena and was friendly with the young family. He had prepared Rose's father John for his entry into Trinity College, Dublin. He was when you needed Latin and things like that. She was interested in the manuscript tradition from an early age. On a visit to Oxford in 1891, she went twice to the Bodleian and saw there, on the first occasion, the manuscripts of the Annals of Tiernach. And then on her second visit, she examined the life of Colin Gillick by O'Donnell. In the same year, in June, she lunched with Professor Rees at Oxford, so she's in at the top of these people. On a visit to London in 1903, she stayed with her sister Ethel and began attending Michael Branagh's Irish language classes in London. It's a whole world that no one knows anything about either. London and the Irish movement there was huge. Back in Glengarry in 1904, she noticed that Miss Ada McNeill came to read Irish with me. Ada McNeill, like Dobbs, Ada McNeill became a solid Republican and a tough Republican. One of the anecdotes about him was that the B specials in their early years visited her house to search it because they believed that she was keeping men on the run. And the story goes that she met him at the gate and pulled up her skirt and to reveal a long red petticoat, extracted a gun from the pocket in the petticoat and fired 2 or 3 shots in the air and said, "If you ever come back near this place, I won't miss you." These were the upper class in society. You didn't grade them. And they were a kind of law unto themselves. She had classes from Willie Rooney, and in the same year her sister Mary and her brother Willie went down to Glenarm to the first play of fish. And it was really an Irish-speaking occasion. In 1905 she was at the Oireachtas, the National Irish Language Festival in Dublin, and lunched with Hyde and Una Yoga. She attended the competition in the Irish language plays. Later in the day she was in Belfast with Mrs. Hutton, and they both went to an Irish language play in St Mary's Hall. And the same year she said she went up the Glens to see Willie McShane, Rose McGrogan and Biddy McVeigh to talk Irish. Now I know Biddy McVeigh. Biddy McVeigh was locked into the poorhouse, Cushendall, and she was a traditional native speaker of Irish. Can you imagine what a lady, the like of Roisin O'Doibhlin, coming down the road in her, usually they walked, that's why they lived so long I think, coming down the road, going into the poorhouse and sitting down with Biddy McVeigh to get her Irish. These people were stepping out over their tradition, you see. The same was true with McAdam up in the Glen and recording the song and getting the song of Lynch when he was blind drunk. I mean, the whole Presbyterian tradition was against drinking. And it must have been a great step for him to take, as it was for Miss Young. And all the while she's immersing herself in the living tradition of Irish. Family life goes on at Galgarm as usual. In 1908 she joined College Chacole in Belfast here, in the Falls Road, one of the little colleges the Irish speakers had. Ulster Irish people didn't like it because it was Munster Irish was taught. It was taught there by a famous Sean O'Cahan, he would come up from Waterford, he was a post and telegraph man, and he taught that. He was a brilliant teacher, probably the finest teacher of his generation. He was father or grandfather to Detta Cahan, Dame Detta Cahan, who sits in the House of Lords over in England, and who was made a dame by Lady Thatcher. Ran the Barbican for years for Lady Thatcher. A very outstanding woman. Her grandfather, he has 2 or 3 books, 2 books at least in Irish. And he was an outstanding teacher, recognised all over the country. And he published these 2 books and he paid special tribute to his student Roisin O'Doibhlin. It was probably O'Cahan who introduced her to the Munster song tradition, which is all everywhere in her writings. And it's in the Normal Life at Gilgore, and this entry from the diaries from 1910 is a reading. Ballymena Unionist meeting. Colonel Rowan came for the night to go to it. Captain O'Neill and Lady O'Neill came to an early dinner. That's Terence, the satellite. I went with the whole party to the meeting. And then 7 days later, 17th December, there's this entry. I went to Belfast to the Irish College. She was running the thing. There was no difficulty for her because she was interested. She had found out that Irish contained a wealth of what I today would describe as humanity. She had put her finger on it and nothing was going to turn her. She went to the Unionist meeting. She went then to her classes. The big achievement is the first book, and we'll talk about that in a second. In July 1911, she records a huge party at Galgarm to celebrate the Coronation Day, and at the end of the month she records the Glens Fish at Garntar. All the while she's moving in between those 2 words that I mentioned at the beginning in an intelligent manner. Rose Young clearly saw nothing neither in this kind of life, at this time of writing in the first instance, or later when she was making the final compilation for her diary. Her crowning achievement is the Dúna a Gaeilge. Remember, it was published first in 1921. It was a standard text until 1960, which is a major achievement. You were looking for a text of any of the great songs of Irish. They were in Unani Yoga, Roshni Yoga. They were in her volume, or in her book. And only surprised by a book written by two university professors from the Institute of Advanced Studies, Dúnar. She has a she can put her finger on the great piece of literature. She has that literary sensibility and judgment. Everyone praised the book when it came out. It opened up this whole world. A weary lady scared the anad, my main to womb. Need all the sun the higagum, the hin and the hudish. The mawahirin huilatrum is maharins and the way. The mawitcher fad the very glum. Smagra wad womb. This song, like so many in this collection, has in it all the bare passion of broken-hearted love, a great work of literature. It is the most beautiful love song, she writes, and her notes are brilliant at the back. She says, it's the most beautiful love song, full of fine and pathos. She was getting in touch with the ordinary people, searching out their emotional and imaginative life, their ideas and their feelings, and presenting them accurately and in an intelligent manner. In the same volume, she said she presented Hugger Hain and Sour Lynn. Many of you probably heard her. I have added the second verse, she said, which was taken down by me many years ago from old Mrs. Hamilton in Cohesion, County Antrim. And of Clean the Dri Wira, a religious poem, the Lament of the Three Marys, she writes, Father Aspel Wakatu Mughrahyal, Lachon is a hono. Onig me ballet I hees of it beside her. Father, leading where the Virgin Mary meets Peter on the way to Calvary and says, have you seen my loved one? And she, a hono. And the boy answered, yes, I saw him a while back. Honig me ballet I hees of it beside her. Being crucified by the soldiers. Now, if you've heard she was Joe Haney sing that, you realise the beauty in it. She goes further, she says, a keen of this name used to be chanted at funerals and wakes in Glendon, County Antrim. 3 women took part in it, keen as they marched in the procession to the grave. Mrs. Nellie O'Neill, who died in Glendon some years ago, has acted in this way as one of the 3 Marys. See how important a note that is. This is the use that was made of this song, which is a lament for the Passion of Christ. She recorded it, and it's the only place in Ireland. All the smart folklorists didn't record it. She recorded it. She was out there in the Gaeltacht, up and down to the Glens. And her book has the breath and life of the living Gaeltacht about it. And that Gaeltacht stretched wasn't the little Ulster Gaeltacht that we tend to limit ourselves to. It stretched from Carricknavar, stretched all the way up through Galway, all out to the Isles of Scotland. From all the great people, right through to Nancy Tracy, Bidefrich and Tyrone. She opened up these treasures to the enthusiastic and wide body of readers who were rediscovering Irish and the Gaelic world, and she did it with discernment and judgment. Douglas Hyde praised the volume greatly. Pearse said, we should have gone back to this Gaelic world, really. Built a world on that kind of premise. And as has been said and written of her, that her interest in Irish led to her expulsion from the family home and family circle, and that she was ostracised. This is simply untrue. Anyway, you see that written down as untrue. Lady Brookborough assured me that she used to be brought up to visit Aunt Rose in Cohesion and Ballycastle on a regular basis. And she said she would come out and sit and watch us play tennis. and I believe that. When she died in the Glen, she was taken home to be buried with her own people. My feeling is that some of us Gaels might be more comfortable with a Miss Young that had been ostracised from her family because of her love and devotion to the Irish language. The truth is that Miss Young, like so many of us, find it impossible to define Ireland in political or religious terms, but that down there with the ordinary people was a rich cultural world based on wide human experience and whose secrets and values Rose Young sought to explore and, most importantly, to reveal and transmit to a wider audience. In June 1909, Miss Young has this entry in her diary. I went to Donegal with Ada. I met Ada at Ballymeena station at 9:30. Remember these grand ladies getting on the train? They're going up to Donegal to live in a little cabin for a month. I mean, there were 27 servants in Galgorum, and these people were well off, plenty of money. And they're going up to live in Donegal in a cottage, and they're living on top of each other. You can imagine what it was like. She met Ada McNeill was a particularly difficult kind of woman. People talk about she was a tough lady, and she was in love, of course, with Roger Casement. It's quite clear in her letters that that's all she was interested in. But she was the first person from the north of Ireland to knock the Magriana door in Ranafast and say, I want to learn your Irish. She was taken in, and she was the first outsider really to go into Ranafast. She also always had an Irish-speaking servant. She wouldn't have any servants in the house who didn't speak Irish. And she lived till she was way over 90. All our people are dead and gone, there's nothing left really. Miss Goff joined us at Coleraine. We arrived at Cashelagar at 3 o'clock and walked to meet a boy. She stayed 18 days there as a student at Colas Jolla at Ulster College. Ada was Ada McNeill, as I mentioned. She was not related to Owen McNeill of Glenarm and founder member of the Gaelic League. She was a cousin of Lord Cushendun, lived in Cushendun, and was one of those McNeills who were agent to the Whites of Ballymeena. It seems that it was through Francis Bigger here in Belfast that she began to take an interest in Irish. She was an early member of the Gaelic League and was the organising committee of Feshnilan. She was involved in the Irish College on Rathlin Island, one of the early colleges in Rathlin Island, and most importantly, she was in the organising committee of Colas Jolla, or the Ulster College, and acted as secretary in the early years. Colas Jolla had been set up in 1906. It brought together all creeds and all classes and all differing political affiliations. Miss Dobbs was treasurer because she had the money. Patrick Pearse came there to lecture, as did Owen McNeill and Professor Rees from Oxford. Joseph Mary Plunkett and Roger Casement came there to study the language. And it's a well-recorded fact around Court of Harp that Casement couldn't even manage the simplest of Irish. He never mastered it, he never could learn it. There were solid courses of study in modern Irish, in medieval Irish and Irish history, and there was a strong emphasis on creative writing and of course on the living language. There were walks out in the mountains, trips to the island, Tory and Ireland War, and parties in Eriachty on sunny days up in Balthana, up above Gordahark there. The day ended with a killie in the college and all the students would gather at the local people. Joseph Mary Plunkett wrote about Clachanilly Irish College has a wealth of wit and knowledge, not to speak of health and beauty, grace and graciousness galore. But amongst its charms entrancing, men, wit, songs and dancing, there is nothing so delightful as yourself, Maville's door. Miss McNeill, Miss Young and Miss Dobbs were at those killies. They may be standing there too when the president of the college, Miss Dobbs, gave Paddy McPearse a stern lecture for turning up late for a lecture. You never do that. There was writers there too. Finn McCool was there, Seamus Green began to write there, taught him how to write, I imagine. And it was Phil McNeill who first saw the literary talent that he had. You ought to dismiss all this and say this is upper class women, dilettantes, toying with and pottering about in a strange archaic language.
Women who had little else to do and who were just following a whim or a fancy. This, I believe, would be a gross misleading consideration.
And a grave injustice to their memory. There had always been within the Protestant and Unionist tradition a strand which devoted itself to the cultivation of Irish and saw the cultivation of the living language as important. It stretches back through McAdam and MacDowell and Bryson in the 19th century, through to Richardson and Bedell and Paul O'Hagan in the 18th century, where the native Irish tradition was in reality a set of values, a vision or view of the human condition, an outlook, a storehouse of human experience. We recognise here this afternoon the valuable contribution and the proportion of Irish of Rose Young, of Margaret Hutton, of Ada McNeill and Margaret Dobbs. They knew, as we all should know today, that the language and the culture enshrined in the language is a vast human resource there for us all, Catholic, Protestant and dissenter. That it is a beauty and reality and a great human tug of the heart which is as powerful today as when Miss Young made her trips to Belfast to learn Irish from Shannon Cahan. In the early days before the politics took over, the language movement was a force for drawing people together. It broke down the barriers between the well-off, the middle classes and the poor Irish. It gave an opportunity to people, regardless of sex or background or religious persuasion or political affiliation, to come together for a common purpose, the cultivation and sharing of a rich and varied human tradition that evolved and was continuing to evolve, and to which Miss Young, Miss McNeill and Miss Dobbs and the others contributed so positively. And though there is Gaelic Volume 5, Volume 1 I think it is, published in 1921, Miss Young gives the text of a road to a Gaelic. I was taught Irish in Armagh College, and it was Jerry Hicks, God be good to him, and Sean O'Boyle. And O'Boyle used to read the text of the poem, and Jerry would come punching in with a guitar and sing the thing. Now, I remember them doing this poem, a road to a Gaelic and Wachato and McGrath, and we were told that Carrick was the Massrock, Carrick in Ephraim. When the penal times, priests said Mass out in the field under a Massrock, Carrick in Ephraim. And it wasn't true, of course. And that reminds me that during her stay in Garda Hark, Miss Young went down, she says, I went down to Mass, Sunday Mass, which for a Presbyterian, you know, was a chancy enough thing to do in those years. But she did it. I suspect that what she was doing was she knew that the older speakers would be out at Mass, and that she'd hear better Irish outside the church and around the church than anywhere else. She went to processions for the Blessed Virgin Mary, she BVM as she called her, in Glenarf. Again, I suspect, to get into that Gaelic community and to understand something of what was going on. Road to a Gaelic, no Wachato on McGrath, no Wachato Gilda, no Finja, no Scave, no Ra, no Wachato Bachurus, Bavilsha Blah, no Wachato Ma Valentine, or Shidach Lee Marta. She based the text, she said, on Walsh's popular song and on O'Reilly's poets and poetry of Munster. She adds the following note. Now this is very interesting. Walsh thought the song was a southern one, but couldn't fix its locality. Dr. Joyce heard it sung hundreds of times in Munster, which seems to confirm Walsh's opinion. O'Daly says it was the chef d'oeuvre of Dominic O'Mangan, a County Tyrone poet, and was written in the 18th century in honour of Elizabeth Blecker of Carrick, County Armagh, afterwards Lady Duncan of Upper Harcourt, Bushmill, County Antrim, now called Dundarav. And the point of that is, Miss Young, it seems to me, bringing all of Ireland, all the richness of this Gaelic tradition, and she's bringing them all together, poor poet and landed gentry, north and south, as if the language and the cultural tradition might provide the basis for some kind of cohesion in Ireland that might bring different classes and creeds together and might, in Hyde's telling phrase, make the present a rational continuation of the past. Miss Young, Miss Dobbs, Miss Ada McNeil remained faithful to the Gaelic League spirit until the very end. On 6th of May 1935, Miss Young records the celebration of the King's Silver Jubilee with bonfires on the Antrim coast, and the very next day she's at a meeting of Feshin and Glan and Glenara. At the age of 73, she made the long journey to Dublin, found a vantage point at the pillar to watch her old friend Douglas Hyde pass on his inauguration parade as President of Ireland. November the previous year, she was taking a Mr. McCormick and a Mr. Brogan through a new Irish sling film course written by Martin O'Kane, which is one of the great pleasures of modern Irish. So funny and so witty. The following year, she was at her brother George's funeral. An enormous procession of B specials and orange men marched after the hearse to a halt and gave George a military funeral. Ireland was going its different ways, and political opportunists would exploit and highlight the differences. But Miss Young, within the Irish language and the Irish cultural movement, found the space and the understanding to make a creative and positive contribution, and prepared in a fashion the way for others of her background and disposition to find their place in the Irish language and cultural tradition. Thank you all so very much. I'm sorry to have kept you so long.